Hey there. I am Lorian Hale, and for the last 5 years I have lived alone in a small wooden house on the very edge of Eldermire, the border town where the human lands meet the wild orc territories. I am 28 years old, a simple craftsman who earns his bread by mending broken wagon wheels, sharpening plow blades, building barrels, and taking whatever odd jobs the townsfolk do not want to do themselves. My days are the same. I rise before dawn to split firewood, spend the daylight hours, bend over my workbench, and return at night to a pot of thin porridge, a patched shirt, and the quiet scratch of my quill as I record every copper I owe and every copper I am owed. The house is narrow and old. Its roof creaks in the wind, one window is cracked and sealed with oiled hide, and the floor slopes just enough to make a stranger feel seasick. It is not much, but it is the only thing left to me after my mother died. Her name was Mara Hale. She passed 5 years ago from a lung sickness that came after too many years of hard labor. She was the only person who ever stood firmly on my side, no matter how poor we became. From the time I was small, she taught me never to be ashamed of honest poverty, never to bow my head before the rich simply because they had more coins, and never to raise it too high in pride. After she was gone, I closed myself off from the world. I still worked. Still smiled when the occasion demanded it, but the warmest part of me felt buried with her on the southern hillside of the town graveyard. That night, the first heavy rains of early winter came down in sheets. I had just closed the door of my little workshop behind the house and was coaxing the hearth fire back to life when I heard it, a knock. Not frantic, not angry, but slow and deliberate. 3 measured raps that carried clearly through the storm. In Eldermire, a knock like that after dark usually meant trouble. Debt collectors, bad news, or something worse. I picked up the small axe I kept beside the door, drew a steadying breath, and opened it. A woman stood on my threshold. She was orc, and taller than any human woman I had ever seen, her shoulders broad and her posture straight as a spear. Rain streamed from a dark cloak that could not hide the fine leather and metal armor beneath silver-black clasps at the shoulders, a belt of rare beast hide, and a slender necklace bearing the emblem of one of the greater orc clans. Her face was striking in a cold, strong way, with high cheekbones and eyes the color of polished amber that looked straight into mine, waiting to see what I would do. Before I could speak, she said in clear, low common, "Your mother gave me this address." My heart stopped. Not the gentle surprise of ordinary words, these words slammed into me like a hammer against an anvil. I stared at her, the rain drumming on the roof, and heard my own voice crack as I asked, "What did you say?" She repeated it slower this time. "Your mother, Mara Hale. She is the one who gave me this address." The blood in my veins turned to ice. My mother had been dead 5 years. I had closed her eyes myself. I had carried her to the grave. No one on this earth had the right to speak those words unless they were lying or knew something no living person should know. My first clear thought was that she was a swindler or someone using my mother's name to get inside my house for reasons I could not guess. Yet I did not shut the door. I stepped aside and let her in. She crossed the threshold without hesitation. Inside, she did not look around with the contempt I expected from someone dressed so finely. Instead, her gaze moved slowly over every familiar thing: the chair my mother had once mended with careful stitches, the faded, embroidered cloth on the table, the dented copper pot by the hearth, the small, crooked portrait of my mother hanging on the wall. She looked at them the way a person looks at things she has heard described many times. The familiarity made my skin prickle. I closed the door against the storm and asked her name. "Valira," she answered. I asked her why an orc woman of obvious high birth would come through the rain to a poor man's house simply to speak my dead mother's name. She studied me for a long moment, then said quietly, "Because I owe her a promise." In that instant, I understood that this night would not end with a single strange visit. It would drag the whole buried past of my mother back into the light, along with truths I had never been told. And I knew, with a cold certainty that settled deep in my chest, that nothing in my quiet, careful life would ever be the same again. In the first meeting, I did not welcome Valira. I gestured for her to sit on the only chair, but my voice stayed flat and my posture rigid. I asked her directly where had she known my mother when, how and why she had waited until now to appear. I was ready to catch any lie the moment she slipped. She did not grow angry at my suspicion. Instead, she began to speak in that low, steady voice as if she had rehearsed the words many times in the years since she left Eldermire. Long ago, she told me before she held any rank or title she had been nothing more than a fugitive orc girl fleeing a bloody purge inside her own clan. She was wounded, starving, burning with fever, and close to death when she stumbled near the edge of town. It was my mother who found her collapsed beside the stream on a cold, late autumn night. At first I still refused to believe, but then Valira spoke of things no outsider could possibly invent. She described how my mother always warmed the soup before eating, even if it was only leftovers. She knew the half-tune my mother used to hum while cooking a melody that never quite became a full song. She spoke of the habit my mother had of hiding the last copper coin inside the flour jar instead of the wooden chest, and how she would smooth the folds of the tablecloth with her thumb whenever she was worried. Every small detail struck me like a hammer on an anvil. They were true. Painfully, impossibly true. According to Valira, my mother had not handed her over to the town guards, even though she knew an orc in the house could mean trouble. Instead, she hid her in the old shed behind our home for many days. She cleaned the wounds, cooked thin porridge, gave her old clothes, and asked no questions about her past until the fever finally broke. When Valira asked why a human woman would risk so much for an orc, my mother had simply answered, "When someone is dying, they are a person who needs saving first." I began to waver, but I still fought it. The more she spoke, the more I realized she was telling the truth. And the more I realized that the angrier I became. It meant my mother had lived through something deep and important without ever telling me. It felt as though I had been shut out of a part of the person I loved most. I asked her why my mother had never once mentioned her name. Valira replied that I had been too young, that the townsfolk already feared orcs, and that my mother had not wanted to bring political danger to her only son's door. After that first night, I thought she would leave and never return. But she came back the next evening, and the evening after that. Each time she brought another fragment of memory, how my mother had hidden her when soldiers searched the area, how she taught Valira which wild plants were safe to eat and which were poison, how she patched the torn cloak even though her own clothes were threadbare. She never spoke as if she were boasting about a debt repaid. She spoke like someone carrying a promise that had grown heavy over many years, each detail preserved with care. I asked the question that mattered most. If you owed my mother so much, why come only now? For the first time, Valira stayed silent a long while. Then she said that when she left Eldermire, she had been a hunted runaway with nothing. She had sworn she would return when she was strong enough to stand on her own. But the years that followed pulled her into the brutal struggles for power inside her clan. Again and again, she tried to come back only to be wounded, detained, or forbidden to leave. In short, she had never forgotten. It had simply taken her many years to become free enough to keep her word. Before she left that night, Valira reached into her cloak and drew out a small folded piece of cloth. It was my mother's old handkerchief, the corner stitched with the letter M in dark green thread. I recognized it at once. My mother had said it was lost years ago. Valira had kept it like a talisman all this time. When she laid it on the table, I had no way left to convince myself she was lying. From that moment, the story changed. The feeling inside my chest shifted from suspicion to a sharp, aching curiosity. My mother had made a promise to this orc woman, and that promise somehow involved me. I did not yet know what the promise was, but I already understood one thing with cold clarity. Valira had not come only to repay a debt. She had come because my mother had asked her to. One quieter night after the rain had finally stopped and the only light came from the low fire in the hearth, Valira spoke the words she had been holding back since the first evening she stood at my door. She told me that my mother had made her swear a promise on the last night before she left Eldermire. My mother had taken Valira's hand and said that if she ever survived, if she ever grew strong enough to return, she must come back to this house, not to bring gold or soldiers or land. She was to come and see whether my mother's son was living the life he deserved. I stared at her across the table. To do what Valera did not look away. To see whether you were still the man your mother raised or whether you had let poverty and pride swallow you whole. The words landed like stones. I felt heat rush up my neck. My mother had not simply asked for a debt to be repaid. She had asked Valera to come back years after her own death and judge me, to check if I was still breathing or already buried alive inside my own stubbornness. I stood up so fast the chair scraped against the floor. I don't need a stranger watching over me from beyond the grave, I said, voice tight. I don't need anyone's pity, least of all from an orc who owed my mother a favor. Valera remained seated calm in the firelight. Your mother did not pity you. She feared for you. She knew you would work until your hands bled and still refuse any hand that reached out to help. She knew you would rather starve in silence than admit you were drowning. Her words struck too close. I thought of the leaking roof I had never fixed because the cost frightened me. The ache in my left shoulder that grew worse every time I lifted timber, but which I ignored because healers cost money. The evenings when dinner was nothing but watery porridge and the silence of an empty house. I had told myself I was being strong. Now it sounded like slow suicide. I turned on her. She should have told me herself, not leave a message with someone I would never meet. She did not want to burden you while she was still alive, Valera answered quietly, and she did not want the town to turn against you if they learned she had sheltered an orc. So she asked me to come when I was ready, when I could stand before you as an equal, not as a fugitive. I laughed, short and bitter. Equal. You wear silver on your shoulders and I count coppers by candlelight. We are not equals. She rose then tall and steady. Your mother saw something in me when I had nothing. She asked me to look for the same thing in you. Not your coins, your life. The anger inside me cracked. I sat down again, suddenly tired. For the first time, I asked about her, not about my mother. I wanted to know who this woman had become in the years since she left our shed. Valera told me she now belonged to the noble branch of the Velor clan. After years of fighting and bloodshed, she had reclaimed the rank stolen from her. She oversaw trading caravans in eastern territories. She had power and wealth most humans in Eldermire could only dream of. That explained the fine armor, the calm authority, the way she had looked at my poor house without scorn. But it raised a new question. If you only wanted to repay a debt, I said you could have sent gold or servants or a letter. Why come yourself? Why stand in the rain and walk into this house? She was quiet for a long moment. Then she answered, because the debt was never only gold. Your mother gave me back my life when I believed it was finished. She asked me to make sure her son did not lose his the same way. I came because I needed to see for myself whether the promise still mattered. She reached into her cloak and placed the old handkerchief on the table again, the one with my mother's stitched initial. The green thread caught the firelight. That night your mother hid me. She said I told her I would repay her one day. She smiled and answered, then come back when my boy is grown. If he is still trying to carry the world alone, remind him that even the strongest shoulders grow tired. I stared at the cloth. My throat felt tight. Valera continued softer now. She did not ask me to save you from poverty. She asked me to save you from loneliness. She was afraid you would close every door, including the one that might let someone stay. The fire popped. Outside, the night was still. Inside, something between us shifted. Valera was no longer only the messenger of my mother's past. She had become the only living person still carrying out part of my mother's will. That knowledge made it impossible to keep her at arm's length any longer. Yet the same knowledge frightened me. If I let her step closer, she would see how deeply I had buried my weakness, and she was already watching me with eyes that were no longer cold but patient, waiting to see when I would stop fighting the very thing my mother had feared I needed most. After Valira revealed the full weight of my mother's promise, she stopped circling the truth. She began offering help openly, without hesitation. She wanted to repair the leaking roof, pay for a proper healer for the ache that had settled in my left shoulder, replace my cramped workshop with something larger and drier, even move me to a piece of land on the eastern edge of town where the soil was better and the taxes lower. Each suggestion was practical, each one was generous, and each one felt like a blade pressed against the last piece of pride I still owned. I refused almost everything. It was not because I did not need it. I needed it desperately. The refusal came from a deeper place, a shame I had never named out loud. If I accepted her help, every year I had spent scraping by on my own would suddenly feel worthless. Every night I had gone to bed hungry so I could pay the blacksmith. Every morning I had ignored the pain in my shoulder so I could keep working. Every time I had told myself I was strong enough to carry it all alone would turn into proof that I had been a fool. Accepting her hand would mean admitting my mother had been right to worry. It would mean admitting I had been slowly drowning and pretending the water was only knee-deep. Valira never raised her voice when I said no. She simply looked at me with those amber eyes and asked, "Why does receiving help feel like defeat to you?" I had no clean answer. I only knew that in the years since my mother died, the only thing I had left was the knowledge that I had survived on my own terms. To let an orc woman I barely knew lift me up felt like erasing the only victory I still possessed. Then the accident happened. It was a raw afternoon 3 days later. A strong wind the night before had torn several shingles from the workshop roof. I climbed the ladder with a hammer and a handful of spare planks, telling myself it was a small job I could finish before supper. The wood was wet. My left shoulder burned with every reach. Halfway across the roof, I lost my footing. I fell hard, crashing through the old beams inside the workshop. A heavy rafter pinned my legs and slammed into my back. Pain exploded white behind my eyes. I could not move. I could barely breathe. I lay there among the broken wood and dust, staring at the gray sky through the hole I had just made, and for the first time in years, I felt truly helpless. Valira arrived minutes later. She had taken to stopping by in the late afternoon, though neither of us had named the reason. She found me trapped, heard the groan I could not hold back, and moved with terrifying speed. She lifted the heavy rafter off my legs as if it weighed nothing. Then she knelt, checked the damage, and sent one of her guards for the healer without waiting for me to protest. When she looked at me again, her face was no longer calm. For the first time, I saw real anger in her eyes. "You stubborn, prideful fool," she said, voice low but shaking. "You would rather break your own back than let anyone help you carry the weight. If your mother were still alive, she would slap you first and hold you second." I tried to laugh, but it came out as a cough. She was right. My mother would have done exactly that. The healer came and bound my shoulder and ribs. I was ordered to lie still for at least a week. While I lay on my narrow cot behind the curtain, pain dulling into a deep throb, I finally spoke the fear I had kept hidden even from myself. "I'm terrified of getting used to it," I said into the quiet room. Valira was sitting on the stool beside the bed, sharpening a small knife with slow, even strokes. "I'm terrified that if I let myself lean on someone even for a little while, the day they leave, I will fall harder than before. I already lost my mother. I don't know if I can survive another empty house." She set the knife down. For a long moment, she said nothing. Then she told me her own truth. "When your mother first hid me in that shed, I was afraid of the exact same thing. I told her I did not want kindness because kindness always ends. She looked at me and said, 'No one escapes loss by refusing every good thing that comes before it.' I have carried those words for years. They are the reason I am still alive." Her voice softened. "I am not here only because of a promise anymore, Lorien. I am here because I do not want to leave." That night I took the first small step. I told her she could send her people to fix the workshop roof. I let the healer return the next morning. I even let her look at my ledger of debts and small earnings. It was not surrender. It was the beginning of something quieter and more frightening, the willingness to let another person see how deep the cracks in my life had become. In the days that followed while my body healed, Valira came every afternoon and stayed longer each time. She sat by the fire and listened while I told her stories of my mother, of foolish mistakes I had made as a boy, of the small triumphs and larger failures of a life spent on the edge of town. In return, she spoke of the brutal years inside her clan of battles, fought not just with steel, but with words and betrayal, of how she had kept my mother's handkerchief folded against her heart like a secret she refused to lose. The air between us changed. The silences were no longer guarded. They became comfortable. I found myself listening for the sound of her boots on the path outside. I caught myself smiling when she argued with me over something trivial. For the first time since my mother died, the house no longer felt like a place I was simply enduring. I was beginning to look forward to her visits, not because she carried my mother's memory, but because she carried herself. And that terrified me more than any fall from a roof ever could. One quiet afternoon, while the healer still had me resting, Valira and 2 of her men finished repairing the workshop roof. I hobbled out on a crutch to watch them work. As they lifted the last heavy beam into place, a small wooden box slipped from a hidden crevice in the old wall and fell onto the floor with a soft thud. I picked it up. The wood was dark with age, the lid carved with my mother's simple initials. Inside lay a few small things I remembered. Her brass thimble, a string of wooden beads, a scrap of cloth. And beneath them, folded neatly, a letter, sealed with a drop of wax that had long since cracked. My name was written on the outside in her familiar, slightly shaky hand. I carried the box inside and sat at the table. Valira stepped in behind me, wiping sawdust from her hands. She saw the letter and stayed silent, waiting. I broke the seal and read. The words were dated 3 months before she died. If you're reading this, my dear Lorien, then I have been gone a long time. I do not fear that you will be poor. Poverty can be endured and overcome. What I fear is that you will grow so used to carrying everything alone that you will forget how to let another soul walk beside you. You are stubborn like me, and that strength has kept you alive, but it can also become a wall no one is allowed to cross. A girl once came to our door, an orc girl named Valira. I hid her, fed her, and sent her on her way with a promise. If she ever grew strong enough to return, she was to come back to this house and look at you. Not to give you riches, but to see whether my son was still living or only surviving. If she finds you closed and lonely, I asked her to stay long enough to open the door you have nailed shut. Do not turn her away out of pride, my boy. Let her in, even if it is only for one night. Even if you argue, let someone who owes me a debt repay it by reminding you that warmth still exists in the world. You have already lost me. Do not lose the chance to let someone else stay. With all my love, Mother, I read it twice. Then I simply sat there, the paper trembling between my fingers. Valira moved closer and read over my shoulder. When she finished, she stayed very still. For the first time since the night she had appeared at my door, I saw her eyes glisten. That evening, after the fire was lit and the house grew quiet, I placed the letter on the table between us. I need to know something, I said. My voice was rough. Did you come back only because of this promise? Valira looked at the letter for a long moment. Then she met my eyes. At first, yes. I came because I owed your mother my life, and I had sworn to keep her final request. But the moment I stood on your threshold in the rain and saw this house, the same chair, the same patched window, the same small portrait of her, something changed. I looked at you and heard your voice and watched you fight so hard to stay proud, even while you were breaking. And I realized I did not want to leave again. She reached across the table and touched the corner of my mother's old handkerchief that still lay there. I stayed the second night because I wanted to stay. I came back every evening after that because this house and you started to feel like the only place I did not have to be the noble daughter of the Valor clan. I could simply be here, with someone who did not expect me to command or fight or prove anything. I swallowed hard. The fear I had carried since the accident rose up and would not be pushed down anymore. I'm scared too, I admitted. I'm scared that if I let you stay, if I let myself get used to your footsteps in the house and your voice across the table the day you decide to leave again, I will have nothing left. I already lost my mother. I don't know if I can lose another person who matters. Valera stood. She walked around the table until she was standing in front of me. She placed her hand gently over the letter. Your mother did not send me to save you from poverty, she said. She sent me to save you from living the rest of your life completely alone. And maybe she also sent me because she knew I needed the same thing. She looked down at me, her amber eyes steady and warm. If I stay this time, Lorien, it will not be because of any promise made years ago. It will be because I choose to. Because I do not want to walk away from this house or from you. So I will ask you plainly, if I stay not as someone repaying a debt, but simply as myself, will you let me? The fire crackled softly. The repaired roof no longer leaked. The workshop outside stood straight and strong for the first time in years. I looked at the woman who had walked through rain and years of war just to keep a promise my mother had asked of her, and I felt the last wall I had built around myself finally give way. I reached up and covered her hand with mine. Yes, I said. Stay. In the weeks that followed, the workshop was finished properly. The house stopped leaking. I took on new work from the caravans Valera's clan sent through Eldermire, but I earned every coin through honest labor, not charity. Valera came and went as she pleased, and more often than not, she chose to stay. One late afternoon, sunlight poured through the newly glazed window and fell across the table. My mother's handkerchief lay neatly folded in its usual place. Valera stood by the hearth stirring something that smelled of herbs and meat, humming a half-familiar tune she must have learned from my mother years ago. I watched her and understood at last what my mother had truly asked for. She had not asked Valera to bring me gold or safety. She had asked her to bring me back to life. And in the quiet warmth of that ordinary afternoon, with the woman who had once been a stranger now moving about my kitchen as though she belonged there, I knew the promise had finally been kept, not with wealth or power, but with the simple, stubborn choice to open a door and let someone stay.